Okay, sorry about that if you didn't see my screen before. Let me start again. Michael is the Associate Dean for Scholarly Communications and Collection Services, Penrose Library, University of Denver. He has an MS in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois and an MA in History from the University of Iowa. He has served as chair of the Collection Development and Evaluation section of the Reference and User Services Association and has been a member or chair of many committees within RUSA and the Association for Library Collections and Technical Services. He has served on a variety of national, international, publisher, and vendor library advisory boards also. He is currently serving as the co-chair of a NISO working group to develop recommended practices for demand-driven acquisition of monographs and as the co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Library and Information Science, 4th edition. Barbara is the Senior Digital Content Sales Manager for the Western U.S. and Western Canada at YBP Library Services. She joined YBP in 2006 as the Collection Development Manager for Colorado and Texas. She received her MLS from the University of Denver and has held reference and collection development positions at the Colorado College and at the El Paso County Law Library. Prior to joining YBP, Barbara spent 13 years as an academic sales representative and account services manager for EBSCO Information Services, covering Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and Montana. Rebecca is Institutional Sales Director, Oxford University Press. If you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen and they will do their best to answer them at the conclusion of the presentations. Also, please note the session will be recorded and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a link to the recording. You will also receive a copy of the slides. If you're interested, the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee invites you to use the Twitter back channel #ALCTSCE, it's on the screen, to interact with other participants during this webinar. However, please continue to submit questions for the presenters in the question box on the screen. Neither the presenters nor the host will monitor Twitter during the presentation. As I turn the presentation over to the presenters, there may be a slight delay.
All right, so I think that you can see my slides. I hope so. I clicked on the thing that said to do it, but then it sort of bounced away. So I'm assuming that you can see it because nobody's saying not. We're here today to do part 2 of the demand-driven acquisition webinar that we started about 2 weeks ago. And I know that most of you were at the first one. I know that a few of you, very few of you, are here just for part 2. So we're not really going to go over. We're not going to go over part 2 and part 1 in much detail. What we want to talk about today is really thinking about what the implications are of demand-driven acquisition. What will happen to libraries? What will happen for publishers? What will happen for vendors if we think about demand-driven acquisition on a much bigger scale than we've done it so far? For those of you who were not here last time, and I guess for those of you who want a quick refresher, I want to just talk briefly about what we're thinking about and what we're talking about when we talk about demand-driven acquisition. The rationale for DDA, for demand-driven acquisition, is that we really have never built collections in a way that allows us to provide access to most of the things that are published. We've always had to make choices based on our budgets and buy a relatively small number of the books that are published every year. At University of Denver, we buy about 25,000 books a year, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the millions of books that are published worldwide. And we buy a lot of books that don't get used. So not only are we narrowing down what's available to our users are telling us that a lot of what we buy isn't actually useful for them. So demand-driven acquisition allows you to change the point at which you make those purchases and allows you, therefore, to provide a much wider range of material for your users. Demand-driven acquisition so far has been mostly for eBooks, and it makes sense for it to be for eBooks because eBooks can be provided for users in a very seamless way. Users don't know that a transaction of some sort is going on when they click on that title. They just get into the ebook and it's available for them, and the transaction goes on somewhere behind the scenes. So demand-driven acquisition is really easy, and in fact, I think a no-brainer for demand-driven acquisition. Some of us have been talking about doing print, and print is a little more complicated for a number of reasons, but we can and should be exploring demand-driven acquisition for print as well. When you do demand-driven acquisition, it makes sense, we've discovered, to have some sort of free discovery option. So some way of finding out whether the book is the right book for you and not buying things unintentionally. We want to make sure that when we do demand-driven acquisition, when we do commit our funds, we're buying the books that our users actually need, not just the books that they happen to find with a keyword search. Temporary access is important in demand-driven acquisition because it allows you to provide just the amount of use or provide the book for the amount of use needed. And sometimes purchase is a good thing if the use gets past a certain point. So very quick overview of demand-driven acquisition. We want to talk now, I guess, about sort of how to manage demand-driven acquisition in the long term and on sort of a broader scale. And one way of thinking about demand-driven acquisition is thinking about the consideration pool, thinking about the titles that are available, thinking about how you manage that universe of material that you've decided to make available for your users. And depending on the library, depending on the collection, depending on the needs, that can be a really large collection or it can be a fairly small collection. I think that if you're doing it right in a large academic library, that collection could be enormous. It could be potentially much larger than the collection that we have built over centuries already. We could provide access to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of books through this concept of demand-driven acquisition. We are many years away from that, and it's probably impractical to do it on such a large scale anyway, but it's certainly possible to think about it that way. When you build the consideration pool, when you try to create the pool of titles that's available for your users to potentially trigger a purchase from, you can control that on any level that you want. And so a library could choose to open that up pretty widely and provide things that they probably wouldn't have bought in the past. So for instance, in my library, we've provided access to a lot of travel manuals because we have a lot of study abroad programs, even though we never used to buy those things in print. But you could also control it on a very tight level. You could limit it just to the things that make sense for the programs that you are offering. If you think about the consideration pool as something that you build over time and you need to manage over time, there are a number of things to think about. You need to think about how you build that pool of titles. In most cases, you wouldn't want to do this on a title-by-title basis. You wouldn't want a librarian sitting down every week and going through the process of identifying individual titles to put in that pool. You would want it to be an automatic process of some sort, a process very similar to the approval process where books are automatically sent by a vendor like YBP to an academic library. And so you would want to create broad criteria, criteria that are actually probably broader than those used in a traditional approval plan, because the traditional approval plan is all about exclusion. It's about narrowing things down to what your budget can afford. The goal of creating the consideration pool is actually the opposite, and it's to create as inclusive a collection as possible, to include as many things as make sense from the entire world of published output for your users. So you don't want to necessarily exclude in the same way, and therefore you probably need a different type of criteria to figure out what to put in this pool. Over time, you need to add and remove records, and in the course of adding and removing records, you of course have to add and remove content. You have to make sure that the pool makes sense for what you can afford at that time. You need to make sure that the pool of titles makes sense for your budget and for the type of material that is available. You want to make sure that you have records available because discovery is crucial. when you think of demand-driven acquisition. Unlike the traditional model where we buy the book and it's available for you on the shelf, the book doesn't get purchased unless somebody finds it. You have to search for it. You have to be able to discover it. So as many discovery options as possible should be there for demand-driven acquisition to work. Adding and removing records has to be automatic unless you're at a very small institution, because you cannot have a process where somebody has to manually go in and update records on a daily or weekly basis. There has to be some sort of a discovery record service where records are delivered to you from a vendor of some sort. And there needs to be profiling done at both ends, not just to get things into the collection, but to get things out of the collection. And so you could imagine a scenario where in a particular subject area, the rule is that things stay there for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, automatically, things are removed. In a subject area in humanities, that might be a much longer time period. And so the profiling would be different. And you would say for history books, these remain in the collection for 20 years, whether they've been purchased or not. If you start to think about this sort of profiling, you need to build rules for the length of time that books will remain in this consideration pool. Books need to remain there for different reasons, and for some institutions, books would have to be removed pretty quickly. For other institutions, they'd stay for a longer period of time, and that depends on the subject, it depends on budget, it depends on collection strengths, it depends on a wide range of things. So when you're considering how to do this, there have to be rules for not just how long things stay, but when things get removed and when things get replaced. You might have some subject areas where you keep multiple editions of a book. In some other cases, you would want to remove older editions of a book. There are a wide range of reasons why you would remove content. The reason that we read right now is for content and quality very often. We remove things from the collection because they don't meet our needs for whatever reason. But it's something that's inherent in that book. It's something that we think doesn't need to be in the collection anymore. And that would need to be possible in the consideration pool, just as it is in a print collection. But there also is the need sometimes to remove because of financial risk. If the consideration pool grows too large, you run the danger of overspending. You run the danger of spending out way before the end of the fiscal year. And so I think the goal with the consideration pool is to keep it at the right size relative to your budget, that you're available to provide access to that material throughout the course of the fiscal year. If you can't do that, you might need to remove things temporarily near the end of the fiscal year. So you might realize in May that you need to remove things, and you would want to have rules in place well before May for what sort of things get removed automatically at that point, to allow you to get through the end of the fiscal year, and perhaps put those things back in on July 1st when the fiscal year begins again. So you need rules for both temporary and permanent removal of content. I say all that, but then I have to wonder whether removal is actually necessary at all. And I think for some libraries it may not be necessary to ever remove anything for those financial reasons. You'd still want to remove things for quality reasons, you'd want to remove things for content reasons, you'd want to remove older editions, you'd want to remove things that for whatever reason shouldn't be in the collection. But you wouldn't want to remove things that are perfectly valid things to be there, but you just worry about being able to afford them. And I think that the type of institution where it might be the case that you don't have to remove anything is an institution very much like the University of Denver, where we have a relatively small user base. We have fewer than 10,000 students, and we have a relatively large collection budget, about $5.5 million. And so we may be in a situation where we could never get to the point where there is enough use that we couldn't afford to provide access to those books. And that's an interesting thing to think about and an interesting thing to discover at some point. As you think about this consideration pool and as you think about what to remove and how to remove it, one rule I think that we would want to have in place is that if a book has been used in any way we would want it to remain there longer than a book that hasn't been used in any way. And that includes even things that have just been looked at for a second or two. Things that have never had a short-term loan, that have had no financial transaction, but that have been used in some way. Because users will expect that we will continue to have access to that material. They don't necessarily know that this is a demand-driven acquisition process going on. I also think that we could begin to consider that some of these things, some of these ebooks, some of these print books, are permanently part of the collection even if we haven't bought them yet. So we have a record there. We have a promise to our users that we will buy them. We might want to leave those records there permanently. We would want to have criteria for which sorts of things have this sort of permanent availability. It might be done on a title-by-title basis, so a selector would periodically go through and identify things that make sense to be in the collection forever, based on subject, based on publisher, based on series, based on any number of things. You might want to create those as a broader type of rule. In this subject area, from this publisher, books remain in the collection permanently, which raises a really very important question, in fact, a fundamental question to this entire concept. How do we make sure that unowned titles are available in the future? So right now, if we don't buy a book, we run the risk that we will never be able to buy that book. We buy it when it gets purchased, and then at some point it typically goes out of print. What do you do in a world where you're not buying it at the point of publication, where you're buying it 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years after publication? How do libraries, how do publishers, how do vendors work together to make sure that that stuff is available when somebody wants that book at some point far in the future? Another really important question is how do we fit demand-driven acquisition into consortial purchasing models? Typically we buy things on a consortial level as a way of getting a discounted price by buying in bulk. And demand-driven acquisition is all about really the opposite of that. It's about buying just the things that are used just at the point of need. And those are perhaps contradictory things, and there are a number of consortial demand-driven acquisition projects underway, some pilots, including one in Colorado Alliance of Research Libraries. And one of the things that I hope we figure out is whether it makes sense to do demand-driven acquisition on a consortial level. And then I guess fundamentally the question that we need to ask is, what does this mean for the role of the library? And traditionally the academic library collection has had two missions, right? We've been there for the long term. We've been trying to build a collection that will be there for the future, and we are stewards of the cultural record. And if you're not buying anything at the point of purchase, it's possible that maybe we're not serving as stewards. The other goal is to provide a strong collection for current research and teaching, and I think demand-driven acquisition does that better than the traditional model. But it's a really good question whether we are not able to provide access for the long term if we're building a collection through demand-driven acquisition. However, I do think that maybe the method of building the collection doesn't matter in this context, that we're still providing access to material, whether we're buying it or whether we're selecting it or whether our users are selecting it. So thank you, and we're going to turn over now to Barb.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Let me get my PowerPoint up and running. Can everybody see that? Oops, sorry. Okay, I'm going to talk about demand-driven acquisitions from the perspective of a print and ebook library services vendor. So I am a part of YDP's digital team. This is a team that was formed a couple of years ago. My position is Senior Manager for Digital Content for the Western US and Western Canada. And it's my job to work with our collection development managers throughout the West and Western Canada to help assist our libraries in purchasing electronic content, working with demand-driven programs, all of those things. So what I want to focus on is how DDA works and where we think it might be going based on our experience. I'm going to touch upon the growth of digital services over the last couple of years, talk about the DDA development process that has happened at YBP. We'll take a look at the key features of YBP's demand-driven service, and generally we call this an integrated service in the sense that we are integrated with YBP's approval profiling methodology and the aggregator's platform. We'll take a look at the DDA workflow and talk about the immediate impact of DDA on YBP, what we're seeing in terms of the numbers. See what our future development plans are, and then really kind of talk about some what-if scenarios, see what we think the future might hold. The digital world is uncertain and is constantly changing. It seems like on an almost daily basis. So YBP has been a print book wholesaler for well over 40 years. And in 2006-2007, we really started adding eBooks and digital content into Gobi, which is our online system that our customers use for discovery and ordering, and to integrate that with their acquisitions and collection development workflow. So since 2006, we've really been offering a suite of services that help make discovering, purchasing, and cataloging digital content a little bit easier. We currently today have about 600,000 individual titles. All of these are hosted on our aggregator platforms. These are our partners, so we are partnering with eBury, EBL, and EBSCOhost. We also offer collections and title-by-title purchases that are available on major publisher platforms from some of our publisher partners as well. So folks like Cambridge University Press, Oxford, Springer, Wiley, and some others that you can see here. And our newest entrance into digital services is really the development of our demand-driven acquisition service. So we were essentially asked by our customers to participate in demand-driven acquisition. We were asked by our libraries to start the development of the service, and we've really only been doing this for about a year and a half. Part of this, I think, part of the reason that we were asked to participate in demand-driven acquisitions is some of the functionality that we bring to the table, in the sense that we can provide duplication control across print and digital content for our libraries. Many of our libraries have been using YBP catalog records and shelf-ready services for their print collections for a number of years, and so to be able to take those services and apply them into the demand-driven scenario is where we provide both discovery and point-of-purchase records for titles that are part of the demand-driven process. And then I think what kind of ties that all together is the support of our customer service bibliographers. So this image really kind of shows how YBP has been kind of a bridge, both on the print and digital side, for all of our libraries, and the demand-driven acquisition piece was really just a natural progression for us. So for a long time, Gobi has been kind of a center of everyone's workflow, allowing them to access content, whether it's part of their approval or notification plan, or maybe our libraries are just doing firm orders. Integrating that with tech services, invoicing, and customer service allows our library to see a lot of efficiencies in the acquisition and collection development process. And FY12 was really a watershed year at YBP for digital sales. We had to ask ourselves internally if we were finally kind of reaching the tipping point between print and digital. We saw sales increases in all of the digital categories. So our overall digital sales increased by about 26%. E-approval sales increased by 104%. E-approvals, for those of you who are not familiar with the approval process, is a process whereby a library can decide to, within their approval profile, ask that we send them an e-book versus a print book for either their entire profile or particular subject areas. And I think that the the sales were helped by the increase in overall front list availability that we're seeing from our publishers. So YBP's been tracking this for a number of years, and we've really seen it grow dramatically in the last couple of years. Some weeks we're well above 45%. So what we mean by that is that 45% of the print titles that we are profiling on a weekly basis also have a simultaneous ebook equivalent. So there's a real correlation between what we're seeing in terms of digital increases and also print decreases. And it's a little bit complicated with DDA because we're including in those figures both purchases that have been part of the library programs and also short-term loans. So if you can see by this number, and I got this from my colleague Matt Nauman, our academic product manager, that the DDA increase was dramatic, 2,388%. But the reason for that dramatic increase is that we had nothing prior to a year and a half ago. So today we have 134 demand-driven projects and customers that are now live. We're working with folks all across the U.S. and Canada and also internationally. We've got about 57 customers who are kind of in the queue right now, those folks that we're in the process of talking with about how they want to structure their project. And I think what's been truly amazing to all of us on the digital team and at YBP is that each one of these projects has been different. I think it's interesting to note, too, that over the last year and a half, we started to hear about a lot of folks doing pilots, and very few of the programs that we've implemented have actually ceased. So in many cases, I think what we were wondering, is demand-driven kind of a fad, and what's the trend going to be with that? And we've really seen this become a part of libraries' collection development strategy. So as I mentioned, demand-driven acquisitions was the headline for us in FY12. We have 3 major partners that we are really pleased to be working with, eBury, EBL, and eBooks on EBSCOhost. We've been building the whole demand-driven acquisition service in phases, and our very first phase, which was back in, I believe it was February of 2011, was with EBL. So that's where we really kind of figured out the basic workflow in terms of title feeds between YBP and the aggregators, what data we needed to pass back and forth. Phase 2, which happened in April 2011, was integration with eBury. And we also released a piece of our DDA program that we think is particularly interesting, and that's called manual DDA. And what that allows you to do is, rather than, as Michael talked about, just feeding the consideration pool with an automated feed on a weekly basis, you also have the ability to give your selectors the authority to add titles on an individual basis in Gobi. So as they're looking at their notification slips or discovering titles that they think should go to demand-driven, they have the ability to just mark those and request that they be moved into the demand-driven pool. And then our latest launch was Phase 3 in July of this year, and that is our multi-vendor support. So up until this year, our libraries that we were working with had to decide to work with one aggregator over another. They can now choose to do programs with eBury, EBL, and EBSCO all at the same time. We've also, another point that I thought Michael made really well was the fact that one of the things that we've discovered is that this is very different than writing an approval profile. It's almost the exact opposite. So what some of our libraries were telling us is that they didn't have broad enough coverage. So as part of Phase 3, we now can provide our libraries with access to the entire catalogs from EBL or eBury or eBooks on EBSCOhost. And then we've added some new reporting functionality in Gobi. The last thing that we just did, eBooks at EBSCOhost came out with their own version of demand-driven and demand-driven lease opportunities, and so we've got customers now able to work with EBSCO as well. So I just want to review kind of the key features of our demand-driven acquisition service. Again, it combines a YBP profile with the aggregator platform. and presents the patrons on an automated basis with a growing database of titles that they can choose to browse, loan, or purchase, also known as the consideration pool. Your patrons are exposed to far more titles than the library can actually purchase, and the YBP profiling methodology guarantees that appropriate academic titles are populating the consideration pool. Manual DDA allows selectors to be part of the process and to add individual titles to the pool. And then all of the kind of back-end things that we've been doing, record creation, dupe control, electronic invoicing, and customer service really kind of tie it all together. So each week, the way that DDA works is that new titles that match a customer's profile are created and sent to the aggregators that they've chosen to work with. The aggregators will confirm eligibility of those titles for DDA and send us back a title feed of eligible titles. We will then go ahead and create discovery records and put them on our server for customers to pick up. They will then load those records into their OPAC and or discovery layer. And as Michael mentioned, it's really important to make these completely discoverable. The records will have an embedded URL that will link the patron seamlessly to that title on the aggregator platform. And the patrons, once they get to the aggregator platform, are really then governed by decisions that the library has made and also things like the free browse period for the individual aggregators. So again, given the parameters that the library has set up, their patrons can either trigger a short-term loan or trigger a purchase. And ultimately, the customer is invoiced via YBP. So again, putting the invoicing structure for these titles back into their regular acquisitions workflow. I think an important conversation that we've had with each of our libraries where we've brought up a demand-driven program is, what's your goal with this? Are you trying to build a collection here, or are you trying to provide access, a broad level of access to your patrons? And so I think that that's an important point to be thinking about if you're thinking about doing demand-driven. So what's the impact of DDA on YBP as an organization? This is really, I think, one of the first times that we've developed a service in cooperation with customers. We had some really strong beta partners, of which the University of Denver was one. And it's also required us to work very closely with our aggregator partners. It's got ongoing development, so we have to find the balance between that ongoing development and also support our traditional services. We still ship, pick, pack, and ship a lot of print titles on a regular basis. So it's really, for us, required major cooperation among many departments at YBP that may not have happened in the past with just print. But in the end result, what we're finding is that it could result in declining sales for us. The free browse and STL capabilities will ultimately impact our sales. So again, we have to kind of carefully weigh our decisions in terms of our development. What is our current bandwidth for adding to this process? We have to talk to our customers a lot and determine which DDA services are most needed by customers. What's going to enhance this in terms of an overall service? And ultimately, do we need to change our profiling? And as Michael said, the removal piece is probably something that we need to think long and hard about, especially in terms of integrating the current YBP profiling methodology. So I think ultimately DDA has really helped YBP move from a real traditional print bookseller to much more of a content management company. We are just getting underway with our development plans for Phase 4. What we're envisioning right now is that phase will include kind of an overall management dashboard that our libraries will be able to use. We're also talking about the development of a removal service, and again, putting together those parameters that a library will need to take titles out of the discovery pool. As Michael mentioned, we've been involved in a lot of consortial DDA programs. The Orbis Cascade Group is a project that we work with, the Colorado Alliance. We're working with the California State University System Chancellor's Office on a program. So what we found is that we really need to be able, we need the ability to more easily manage multiple channels in the consortial environment and also provide easier access to selectors who are working with maybe individual programs and also consortial programs to be able to identify that information in Gobi. We also kind of need to take a step back at this point and really do some analysis, take a look at some of the metrics, some of the usage statistics that we're getting, and finally figure out how this is all going to work for print. We have a lot of our libraries doing print DDA programs as well, and the difference there is that it's not currently integrated with the ebook DDA programs. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there, and I think closing that loop is something that we need to focus on. So I think, part of the things that we're asking ourselves on a regular basis is, what will the future hold? There's a number of questions that we have about the service. Is this the norm, or is it just a trend? And I think that the fact that we've seen all of these programs continue to exist moving forward and in fact grow is that the numbers argue against the fact that this is just a trend. More and more libraries are making demand-driven, whether it's for print or electronic, a part of their entire collection development strategy. How will ebooks develop? I think that too is not quite a finished product yet. Will ebooks always continue to exist in the current container? Will our publisher partners make more frontlist titles available to the demand-driven process and as ebooks? And will publishers support DDA as sales decline, particularly in the consortial environment? All of those projects need to be negotiated with publishers on an individual basis. And so I think that we still have a lot of data to gather there to see, to make publishers more comfortable. I think only time will tell, and that's why we've taken the approach of kind of a very conservative development schedule for demand-driven, but I think that overall it's been a really positive experience for us, both with our customers and at an organizational level. I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca and let her talk more about the publisher piece.
Thank you very much, Barb and Michael. So I am here today to talk about the demand-driven acquisitions from the publisher side. So while publishers often know a great deal about library purchasing because it's imperative to our business to understand it, the same doesn't necessarily hold true in the other direction. Forums like this webinar are a great way to exchange that information between publishers and libraries and to give libraries a better understanding of a publisher's business models and why a shift from approval plan purchasing of monographs to demand-driven acquisitions may have a significant impact on a scholarly publisher like OUP. So do we, as academic publishers, understand why DDA makes sense to libraries? Absolutely. Don't buy anything until it gets used. It has obvious appeal. So are publishers simply just concerned that it will mean lower sales? No. In reality, it fundamentally upends our financial picture from one of stability and predictability of revenue to cover our costs for this type of publishing, monograph publishing, that is by no means highly profitable. And in fact, a large portion of university presses are subsidized by the universities. It isn't necessarily that we don't think we're going to see purchasing through DDA, though of course this is a concern for the traditional low-use print monograph world. It's a bigger picture issue. So today I'm going to walk you through the impact of DDA through the lens of a scholarly publisher. To start, I thought it would be worth giving you an introduction to or a review of, if you're already familiar with it, the components that make up the financial picture and considerations of scholarly monograph publishing. These are the predominant factors in publishing monographs. I want to be clear, though, what we're talking about here is really only monograph publishing and not the other content types like textbooks, course adoption works, and reference, etc. The traditional academic monograph, which has a very definitive and consistent pattern that it follows. Publishers traditionally see 75 to 80% of the sales of a monograph in the first year it's published, which means the vast majority of the revenue is brought in quickly and publishers are able to recoup some of their investment fast. So let's start by looking at the current model for acquiring monographs, and I'll provide a bit more detail. So on the slide, you'll see author advance. And author advance is generally quite modest for monographs. Authors are paid an advance against royalties that they're expected to earn over time, typically within the first year of sales. If the sales don't live up to the expectations within that first year, the unearned portion of the advance sits directly against as a line item in a publisher's profit and loss statement as a negative balance. So unearned royalties are a very costly contingency that publishers must take against their final sales results. For scholarly publishers, the traditional sales pattern has been very predictable, so we could relatively accurately project what kind of advance is appropriate and ensure that the carryover of the unearned royalties was minimal. The next important factor is author royalty. Again, it's pretty standard in monograph publishing with rare exceptions. Production costs, again, they're somewhat standard with variations based on page count, illustrations, etc. List price, again, it's more or less standard based on page count. Sometimes other costs can impact the price, such as permissions if it's filled with third-party material. And of course, discipline is a factor. There is, of course, a noticeable difference between the price of monographs in the humanities versus those in FTM. Next is discipline growth. It's not a cost factor, but it's really a strategic review of the discipline that influences a publisher's decision to continue publishing in that particular discipline, to expand the publishing program, or, as is sometimes the case, to pull back or fold the program altogether. Editorial strategy, it follows on from the discipline reviews, but what I mean here is a broader in that publishing decisions are influenced by discipline status, but also by the overarching publishing strategy of a given press. This can be the result of any number of factors, especially with a press that looks more and more at the business from a global perspective, as do many now. And finally, sales forecast, and much more on that in the next couple of slides. And while our sales forecasts are not entirely based on the approval plan model that libraries use, it is, in fact, in many ways influenced by it. So as I said, a little bit more now on sales forecasts. Please bear in mind that the numbers I'm going to be giving today are averages through the sales trends for monographs. They tend to be fairly consistent, especially with a broad category like the humanities. And while we've seen print monograph sales decline over time, that decline until up to now has been remarkably slow. The end result has been that sales patterns are historically consistent and to a great extent highly predictable. So this is giving us the opportunity to look through at profit and loss statements for a monograph. What I've done here is extracted the sales forecast piece of our standard profit and loss statement for a recently acquired title. We forecast sales for monographs for over a 3-year period, and you can clearly see here that most of the sales are built into the first year. As I said, roughly 80%. Included in these figures is not just approval plan sales, but really incremental sales as well from conferences, from direct mail campaigns, and post-year 1 sales are driven by reviews, as monograph reviews sometimes follow long after the release. I really want to emphasize that the way we currently forecast sales, because this is so critical to understanding how demand-driven acquisition will force us to really rethink our business model. In many ways, we are now, where we are now, is a result of the approval plan process. Not only the fact that the sales are somewhat predictable, but also the way we're able to calendarize the sales and costs. So the current model, as I mentioned, is highly predictable. DDA will be much less predictable, but the cost structure will remain the same, more or less, as it is now, at least for the foreseeable future, which would mean major adaptation in our royalty structure, in our cost recovery structure, meaning it could take potentially even longer to recover our costs, which is a significant balance sheet issue for a for-profit or non-profit publisher alike, and the way we review the success of our program. You can see on this slide it leaves us with 2 areas with complete question marks. How many sales are we going to make, and when are we going to make those sales? So in a demand-driven world, you can no longer make those assumptions about when to expect sales. If DDA were to be completely widely adopted, we might see 100 sales in year 1. We might see 25 in year 2. We might see, and then we might see another 100 in year 4 or 5. But yet we still have the upfront costs associated with the publication. costs that traditionally have been in large part covered generally at the point of book releases or within the first year, primarily due to the approval plan. If we don't then cover those costs, the costs either are reported as a loss that year or carried on over a long period of time, particularly in the case of an author advance, which really then sits as negative on our company's balance sheet every year until it's earned out by making enough sales. So what happens if publishers no longer have the reliability of approval plans? How might demand-driven acquisition impact our business model? And we can't use the standard format profit and loss, as those figures just completely go out the window. So what we are doing and what other publishers are doing is right now thinking very hard about how to adapt to this change. So what can we do to adapt and ensure our sustainability as a monograph publisher? Definitely, we don't have all the answers yet. We don't even have most of them, but we're committed to our mission, and it's critical that we do make this, we do adapt to these changes. So a couple of areas that we're investing either time or resource in is specifically in discoverability. E-monograph usage is demonstrably stronger than print. Discoverability and enhanced metadata is crucial to driving that usage. We now have this amazing ability to expose our content to users where a library might not have previously purchased, as Michael was saying, should we get the books into the catalog in a DDA program. The old world where the printed book sat on the shelf only to be exposed through a catalog record with light bibliographic data is gone. Now users will be able to get to find the detail within that book container in a way that they never could before. And it could be linked directly to other really important works in a way that was never possible before as well, besides being cataloged and shelved in the same location. Another step we've taken is we've launched the Oxford Index, which is a purpose-built solution to allow users to search every item of content that we make available digitally, such as a chapter in a monograph. And we surround that item of content with really rich metadata, editorially created, and it allows for content connections and context-sensitive searching in a much more powerful way. It's not a product that we sell. It's a free tool that enhances scholarly research by providing contextual information for every item of content we make available digitally. All of these discoverability initiatives are not solely because demand-driven acquisition is in place, but because we now have far more opportunities to help users find great content that has always been around, but they simply couldn't find it. We've also been very willing to experiment with DDA offerings via aggregators, partnering with all the major suppliers to do so. We can't be afraid of this. We have to use the information we find in these experiments to help us analyze the data that comes back. Basically what we need to do is experiment with these programs. And the type of analysis we'll be conducting to see what the results are and how we can best shift our business model so that we can continue to make the best scholarship available while maintaining a financially feasible means of doing so. So just to quickly summarize and put a few more questions out there, as did Barb as well, DDA presents a challenge. So it introduces a highly unpredictable sales model, which is a fundamental shift for publishing, and we need to find a way to adapt to that as this model becomes more prevalent in order to be a sustainable business. DDA also introduces and presents an opportunity to expose our content where sales didn't exist before, where users didn't know that these works were available, and publishers should see that as a positive impact of DDA. So two questions for the library community that I have and that I often bring up with librarians is specifically about demand-driven usage and the impact on ILL. If publishers are expected to be reliant on demand to trigger ebook purchasing, or any purchasing, specifically multiple demands, what does that mean for the future of ILL? Isn't ILL a demand? And if we need that demand to help support our programs, isn't there an inherent conflict in the request by libraries to allow ILL of ebooks bought on demand? And then how does short-term loan play into this? Should that be used instead of ILL? And secondly, if we are to be reliant on demand being the trigger for purchase, will libraries be open to all the new methods of discoverability, like putting snippets of information about not yet purchased content on the free web, or providing results from content not owned by the library mixed with owned content when that's not part of a DDA program? So these are two of the thorny questions we have, and that concludes my part of the presentation. And I will turn it over now to questions.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. We'll open the floor to questions. Please type your question in the question pane, and if you want to address it to a specific presenter, please do that too. We have about 8 or 9 minutes for questions, and if we don't answer all of them during our time today, we save them, the presenters answer them, and then we send it to to all of you. So please feel free to type in your questions. So far nobody has questions, but we'll give it a little bit longer. Here's one. What might be the smallest size of an academic library participating in DDA? And I don't know who wants to address that one.
This is Michael.
This is Barb. I can.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
All right. I was just going to say I don't know that there's. Go ahead.
There's not really a size limit. I mean, we've got everybody from the top ARLs down to what I consider one of our smallest is really a medical library, just a small hospital library, doing demand driven. So I don't know that there really is any kind of size limitation.
Right, and that's what I was going to say too. I don't know why there would be a size limitation. You can manage the amount of the number of titles available relative to your budget, and you can provide a pretty small number of titles, but you could still do it for a small library. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, having talked to EVL quite a bit, they can predict really accurately, relative to your budget and user size, how many titles will get used and at what level and what your spending will be.
Okay, next question. What device do users use to read the eBooks?
I guess I'll start with that. It depends on the vendor, obviously, but people are reading the EBL books that we have primarily on the iPad, on the Nook, on their laptop. Not so much. I don't think that the Kindle, unfortunately, has been a barrier so far for the things that academic libraries are providing. It's generally harder to provide access to them through the aggregators than it is through the publishers, who tend to be more open on what sorts of devices can be used.
Anybody else want to comment? Okay. The next couple of questions have to do with costs. One says, it strikes me as counterintuitive that ebooks cost as much or more than print, and another audience member asks, why in general are individual ebook titles more expensive than print books? So one of you can handle that one.
I guess this is probably better for the publisher to handle. It depends on the publisher's pricing policies. I wouldn't say in general every single publisher charges more for academic content available in e-format. Not the 24-hour access, I know, is something that's always mentioned. The amount of users that can simultaneously use it, where you used to need to buy multiple books, or there's a history of a particular product line where libraries would buy multiple copies and circulate them. There's sort of numerous factors at this point in time. I think also, pricing is a work in progress. I think publishers are testing out all different kinds of options in terms of how they price ebooks.
Okay. The next question is, how does DDA address books included in many syllabi, or is that something related more to college bookstores than DDA?
Well, I think it's a matter of publishers are probably not allowing books with unlimited use or multiple users that are textbook type material into these programs. It's probably more the traditional monographs or books that have single user limitations. I mentioned before that monograph publishing is not the most profitable part of a press's list. It certainly isn't. What does help sustain us and allows us to publish things that aren't profitable are the few books in our overall program that do get course adoptions, as well as or straight textbooks. So it's a sustainability question, and ensuring that we're participating with books that we should participate with. The single purchasing by a library won't have a negative impact on a publisher's bottom line.
Okay. Next question. Can you address licensing issues with ILL and DDA/PDA?
I'll take a stab at this, and I'll also take a stab at answering Rebecca's question about ILL. I think that I hear librarians ask a lot about whether we can provide or whether we can loan ebooks from one library to another. And it seems to me that that's the wrong question. Really, the right question is how to provide access to things that are not in our collection to our users as fast and as cheaply as possible. And interlibrary loan makes perfect sense for getting a print book from one library to another. I don't think it makes any sense at all for getting an ebook into a user. I was going to say into a user's hands, but of course the ebook never gets into the hands. But getting an ebook to the user, if you can do a short-term loan and do it quickly, it seems that takes away any need for licensing issues relating to interlibrary loan of ebooks in general, not just of DDA and PDA.
Okay. Next question. When you choose an ebook platform like eBury through YBP, can you also purchase ebook titles on an individual basis?
Yes. But I'll let Barb do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We have lots of libraries who are maybe doing a demand-driven program with one aggregator over another, but they still are buying lots of content from the other aggregators as well as individual titles.
Okay. Barb, I think this is another question for you. What's the timeline for YBP Phase 4?
We are just getting started speccing that out. So I would say sometime in 2013.
Okay. Here's the last question so far. Would libraries accept to be paying a certain fee for having books available in their consideration pool and ready for use? This is addressing Rebecca's point about sales predictability for publishers.
As the librarian here, I guess I will take a stab at that. Yes, I would be willing to pay something, and it's not just for that reason. When we first started talking about doing demand-driven acquisition with Blackwell, we were talking about the fact that maybe one way of thinking about it is that we pay Blackwell for the service, and we don't actually buy any of these books from them. And so we're giving Blackwell money, and Blackwell, of course, doesn't exist anymore, but we would be giving Blackwell money for this service. And Barb talked about the fact that YBP is morphing from a bookseller to a content provider. And really, if you think about that, we would be paying for the service, and maybe we don't pay YBP anything for the books themselves. We pay the publisher, or we pay Amazon, or we pay some other entity that can get that book to us as fast as possible. And if you think about it that way, then maybe the way to think about demand-driven acquisition and the consideration pool in general is that you're paying you pay for this service, and that money could be divided out in different ways. The service is all about discoverability and about profiling and about making things available. The money that you spend on books goes somewhere else. So I'd be willing to do that.
Okay.
Sorry. Within reason.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for today. So first I want to thank Michael, Barb, and Rebecca for this excellent discussion of issues surrounding demand-driven acquisitions. And let me switch screens here. Let's see. Here we go. I want to thank all the attendees. We hope you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. The comments that are received are reviewed by the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee and used to plan additional continuing education offerings. Information about all ALCTS webinars are featured on the ALCTS website, so you can follow the link on this slide. We have a number of webinars scheduled for 2012, and I've shown the ones through November. ALCTS also offers web courses on a number of topics listed here. Check the website for exact times, as they are offered multiple times throughout the year. Finally, don't forget about our e-forums, which are targeted two-day discussions on a particular topic. Further details on these can be found on the website as well. You can suggest a webinar topic or other continuing education idea through the link to the ALCTS website on the screen. Before we sign off, I would like to thank Felicity Dykes for providing technical support for today's webinar. The Continuing Education Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee make it possible to present these webinars smoothly. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS for Continuing Education offerings again in the future. Thank you.